In the packed gymnasium of Westbrook High, a flashy dojo master was about to turn a peaceful exhibition into a spectacle. What began as a martial arts showcase for families and students turned deadly serious when the Dragon Dojo's arrogant leader mocked and humiliated challengers on the mat. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical guest of honor. For decades, he was a world karate champion, a black belt across multiple disciplines, known for redefining martial arts, both in competition and on screen. When Master Harlan the Dragon Kane taunted him as just a Hollywood stunt fighter, Kane had no idea he was goading a legend who had mastered the art of restraint. Chuck's calm, strategic response would trigger a lesson more devastating than any roundhouse one that stripped arrogance bare before an entire community. What began as showboating would become a reckoning. The Tri-State Martial Arts exhibition would never be the same after pride collided with humility, and the Dragon Master discovered what true strength really means. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gymnasium of Westbrook High School had transformed overnight. Gone were the basketball hoops and scoreboard signs. Instead, bright banners in red, black, and gold hung from the rafters, proclaiming the 1987 Tri-State Martial Arts Exhibition. The polished wooden floor now featured 5 large square mats, arranged in a cross pattern, each one a different color representing the various disciplines on display. Bleachers strained under the weight of spectators, families with excited children, martial arts enthusiasts, and curious onlookers from across the suburban town of Oak Ridge. The air crackled with anticipation, and the sharp scent of incense burning at a small shrine near the entrance. Camera flashes punctuated the murmur of the crowd as local masters led their students through preliminary warm-ups. 15-year-old Lena Torres adjusted her white belt nervously. Her dark ponytail was pulled tight, not a strand out of place. Just as Master Kane had insisted. Her palms were sweaty against the crisp fabric of her uniform. "Stop fidgeting," hissed Master Harlan Kane, not looking at her but somehow sensing her movement. "You represent the Dragon Dojo. Act like it." "Yes, Master Kane," she answered automatically. From her position at the edge of the central mat, Lena could see everything. Master Kane, the dragon, as he insisted everyone call him, stood tall in his custom black gi, with red and gold dragons embroidered along the sleeves. Unlike the other masters who wore traditional uniforms, Kane's outfit seemed designed more for show than practicality, complete with a headband bearing his dojo's symbol. At 43, he was lean and wiry, with sharp features and eyes that constantly swept the room, assessing, calculating. The exhibition officially began with a ceremony led by the event organizer, Mrs. Chen, a diminutive woman with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades perfecting her discipline. "We welcome masters and students from across 3 states," she announced into the microphone. "Today is not about competition, but celebration, a chance to learn from each other and honor the traditions that unite us." The crowd applauded politely. One by one, the masters demonstrated their art. Master Tanaka's students performed synchronized kata, their movements flowing like water. Master Rodriguez led his kickboxers through lightning-fast combinations that drew appreciative gasps. The Wu-Tang school displayed traditional Chinese forms with such grace that even the rowdiest children fell silent. Then came Master Kane's turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed without a microphone, "the Dragon Dojo doesn't just teach, we transform. We don't just practice, we perfect." The music changed abruptly to pounding drums and electric guitar as Kane's students, Lena among them, rushed onto the mat in formation. What followed wasn't the dignified demonstration the other schools had shown, but a spectacle. Synchronized kicks, breaking boards held by assistants, exaggerated battle cries, and acrobatic flips that had more in common with gymnastics than traditional martial arts. Cain himself was the finale. He called forward 4 of his black belt students, who surrounded him with practice weapons. With theatrical flourish, he disarmed each one, adding unnecessary spins and poses after each victory. "That's not how it works in a real fight," whispered a gray-haired man next to Lena, who had returned to the sidelines. She recognized him as Master Wu, whose small traditional school operated on the other side of town. Unlike Cain, who advertised aggressively and promised results in weeks, not years, Wu rarely sought new students and never made public displays. The crowd, though, ate it up. They cheered and whistled as Cain took his bows. 1, 2, 3, each deeper and more dramatic than the last. The other masters nodded politely, though Lena noticed the tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. It was during this applause that the side door opened, admitting a late arrival. A few heads turned, then a few more, creating a ripple of recognition that spread across the gymnasium. Lena felt her breath catch. Even from a distance, she knew exactly who he was. Chuck Norris. Not dressed for show in a flashy gi like Cain, but in simple dark pants and a button-up shirt, his reddish beard neatly trimmed. He nodded to those who recognized him but made no grand entrance, slipping instead into an empty spot in the VIP section where sponsors and special guests Saturday. "Is that?" she began. "Yes," Master Wu said beside her, a smile warming his weathered face. "Chuck came after all. He promised he would try if his filming schedule allowed." "You know him?" Lena couldn't keep the awe from her voice. "Many years ago. We trained together briefly," Wu said. He never forgets his roots in the martial arts community. Despite his Hollywood success, Cain hadn't noticed the new arrival yet. He was busy basking in the applause, directing his students to demonstrate more breaks and strikes while he prowled the mat like a showman, playing to the crowd, pointing at audience members, and encouraging louder cheers. Lena couldn't take her eyes off Chuck Norris. He sat quietly, focused on the demonstrations, occasionally exchanging brief words with the woman beside him. No entourage, no fanfare. Just a man who had come to watch martial artists practice their craft. The contrast with her own master couldn't have been more stark. "What makes him so special?" she asked Master Wu, surprising herself with her boldness. The old man considered her question. "Chuck trained harder than anyone I've ever known, but that's not what makes him special." He paused, watching as Norris applauded politely for a young student who had just completed a form. "It's that, after all his achievements, he still sits there like a beginner, ready to learn." Cain's voice cut through their conversation. "Now, for the real test of martial arts excellence," he announced. "I invite any black belt present to step forward and exchange techniques with the Dragon Dojo." This wasn't on the program. Mrs. Chen stepped forward with a concerned expression, but Cain was already selling it to the crowd. "What good is practice without pressure?" he asked rhetorically. "What good are forms without function? Who will step up?" A middle-aged man in a worn black belt rose from the bleachers. Lena recognized him as Mr. Hayashi, who taught children's classes at the community center. He wasn't flashy or particularly athletic, just a dedicated practitioner who loved teaching kids. "Excellent!" Cain clapped his hands together. "A volunteer! Your style, sir?" "Traditional Shotokan." "Mr. Hayashi said, bowing respectfully as he stepped onto the mat. "Old school." Cain turned to the audience with a theatrical wink. "Let's see how it holds up." What followed wasn't the respectful exchange of techniques that exhibitions typically featured. Cain moved aggressively, pushing Hayashi across the mat with flashy combinations. When the older man attempted a traditional counter, Kane slipped it easily and tapped him with just enough force to make the point, but hard enough that everyone could see who was in control. It ended quickly. Hayashi, breathing hard, bowed and thanked Kane for the match. But instead of returning the bow with equal respect, Kane turned to the crowd. "You see the difference?" he called out. "Traditional is nice for forms and meditation, but when it comes to real fighting..." He let the implication hang in the air as Mr. Hayashi quietly left the mat, face flushed with embarrassment. "That was unnecessary," Master Wu murmured, his earlier smile gone. 2 more challengers came forward, a visiting instructor from a neighboring town and a younger black belt who had competed in tournaments. Kane dispatched both with similar showmanship, never missing the opportunity to point out the flaws in their styles or to emphasize his own superiority. After the 3rd match, something changed in the atmosphere of the gymnasium. The initial excitement had soured into discomfort. Parents exchanged glances. Other masters watched with tight expressions. Some spectators even began to gather their things, preparing for an early exit. "Will no one else test themselves?" Kane called out, turning slowly to survey the crowd. "Surely there's someone here who..." His voice cut off abruptly as his gaze fell on the VIP section. For a moment, his confident expression flickered. He had finally noticed Chuck Norris. The silence stretched. Lena held her breath. Master Wu straightened beside her, suddenly alert. Then Kane's face transformed, a slow smile spreading across his features. "Well," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet gymnasium, "it seems we have a celebrity in our midst." Every head turned toward Chuck, who remained seated, his expression neutral. "Perhaps," Kane continued, "our special guest would honor us with a demonstration of Hollywood martial arts?" The challenge hung in the air. Lena looked between her master and the quiet man in the VIP section, feeling the atmosphere grow taut with tension. This wasn't just another challenge. This was something else, entirely a collision of 2 worlds, 2 philosophies, 2 entirely different understandings of what it meant to be a martial artist. And every person in that gymnasium could feel it. Chuck Norris didn't move. He didn't need to. Not yet. Master Kane didn't wait for Chuck Norris to respond. Instead, he turned back to the crowd, arms spread wide, playing the moment for all it was worth. "Perhaps our Hollywood friend prefers the safety of stunt doubles and camera tricks." His voice carried an edge of mockery barely disguised as humor. A few uncomfortable laughs rippled through the audience, but most remained silent, sensing the tension building. Lena shifted her weight uneasily. She had joined Master Kane's dojo 2 years ago, drawn by the flashy advertisements promising to transform awkward teenagers into confident fighters. Her parents had been hesitant, the monthly fees were steep, but she had begged until they relented. Now, watching Kane publicly mock a respected martial artist, something cold and heavy settled in her stomach. "This is wrong," she whispered. Master Wu nodded slightly beside her. "Pride before the fall," he murmured, so softly only she could hear. Kane was calling for another challenger, his voice louder, his movements more theatrical as he prowled across the mat. An older man with gray at his temples stepped forward. Lena recognized him as a 3rd-degree black belt from Master Rodriguez's school. "Ah, another brave soul," Kane announced. "Your name and style?" "Jim Brennan. Taekwondo. 27 years. The man's voice was quiet but carried across the silent gymnasium. "Nearly 3 decades?" Kane raised his eyebrows with exaggerated surprise. "Let's see what experience brings to the mat." What followed wasn't a match so much as a humiliation. Kane didn't just counter Brennan's techniques, he openly mocked them, exaggerating the man's style, adding commentary for the crowd. "Is this what they teach after 27 years?" he asked loudly after slipping past a textbook sidekick. "No wonder the traditional schools are losing students." Jim Brennan's face reddened, but he maintained his composure, trying several more combinations before Kane swept his legs and sent him tumbling to the mat. The fall wasn't particularly hard, but Kane made a show of waiting for Brennan to rise, checking an imaginary watch on his wrist that drew a few reluctant laughs from the crowd. When Brennan finally stood and bowed to signify the end of the match, Kane barely inclined his head before turning away, already addressing the audience. "Who else wants to test their skills?" His eyes swept the gymnasium, deliberately avoiding the VIP section where Chuck Norris sat motionless, his expression unchanged. "Anyone? Don't be shy." Mrs. Chen approached the edge of the mat, clearly intending to redirect the exhibition back to its original purpose. But before she could speak, a young woman stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 20, her black belt tied neatly over a crisp white uniform. "Sarah Ikeda," she said, bowing formally. "Aikido." Kane's smile widened. "Aikido? The gentle art?" He made air quotes around the words, drawing more uncomfortable laughter. "Well, let's see how gentle meets reality." Lena watched in growing dismay as Kane systematically dismantled the young woman's techniques. Aikido relied on redirecting an opponent's energy, but Kane seemed to anticipate every move, countering before Sarah could establish her grip or position. When she attempted a classic wrist control, he twisted free and used the momentum to send her stumbling across the mat. "Control my center?" he taunted, referencing a fundamental Aikido principle. "You can't even control your balance." The young woman's cheeks flushed with humiliation, but she continued, trying a different approach. Kane allowed her to grab his wrist, appearing to give her the leverage she needed, only to suddenly reverse the technique and flip her onto her back. The impact wasn't dangerous, but it was decisive. Sarah lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of her, before slowly rising to her feet. Her eyes glistened, but she held her composure, bowing deeply. Kane barely acknowledged her before turning back to the crowd. "Is this the best the traditional arts have to offer?" he called out. "All these ancient techniques look good in demonstrations, but when faced with modern, practical fighting," he shrugged dramatically. Across the gymnasium, Chuck Norris remained seated, his expression unreadable. But Lena, watching closely, saw something shift in his eyes, a hardening, a focus that hadn't been there before. Master Wu sighed beside her. "He doesn't understand what he's doing," the old man said quietly. "What do you mean?" Lena asked. "Your master is confusing winning with teaching. He's mistaking humiliation for instruction." Wu's voice carried no judgment, only a deep sadness. "Each person who steps on that mat brings years of dedication, and he treats them as props for his ego." Lena wanted to defend Kane. This was her master, after all, the man whose approval she had sought for 2 years, but the words stuck in her throat. Because Master Wu was right. This wasn't an exhibition anymore. It was a spectacle with Kane at the center, feeding off the discomfort and tension. "No more takers?" Kane called out, turning slowly to face the VIP section directly. "Perhaps our celebrity guest might show us what Hollywood fighting looks like? Or does Mr. Norris only fight when the cameras are rolling and the punches are choreographed?" Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. A collective intake of breath swept through the gymnasium. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, sensing the confrontation building. Parents with young children began to gather their belongings, unsure if what might follow was appropriate for young eyes. Still, Chuck Norris didn't move. He sat calmly, hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady on Kane. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Kane's smile tightened at the edges. "Come now, Mr. Norris," he pressed, his voice carrying a sharper edge. "Surely the star of all those action movies isn't afraid of a friendly exchange? Or perhaps—" His voice dropped to a theatrical stage whisper. "Perhaps the legends are just that. Legends." Something shifted in the atmosphere of the gymnasium. The crowd's discomfort had transformed into a palpable anticipation. Camera flashes became more frequent. Whispers rippled through the bleachers. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The chant began somewhere in the back of the gymnasium, just a few voices at first, then more, building steadily until it filled the space. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Lena found herself holding her breath. Master Wu had gone very still beside her, his eyes never leaving Chuck Norris. Kane stood at the center of the mat, arms crossed, his smile fixed but his eyes betraying a flicker of uncertainty. He had pushed and pushed and pushed, but the man he had targeted hadn't reacted at all. That, more than anything, seemed to unnerve him. "Perhaps Mr. Norris feels it wouldn't be fair," Kane called out, raising his voice to be heard over the chanting. "After all, I understand completely. If he doesn't want to risk his reputation against someone who actually fights for real." The chanting grew louder. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" And then, almost imperceptibly at first, Chuck Norris moved. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't leap to his feet or storm toward the mat. He simply stood, smoothly and deliberately, straightening his shirt with a small, precise movement. The chanting stopped instantly. The gymnasium fell into a silence so complete that Lena could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Chuck didn't speak. He didn't need to. His calm, measured gaze said everything necessary as he looked directly at Master Kane. For the first time that day, Kane's cocky smile faltered. The gymnasium hung suspended in that perfect silence, the kind that comes only before something momentous. Chuck Norris stood motionless, his presence commanding attention, without demanding it. He hadn't spoken a single word, hadn't made a single threatening gesture, yet the atmosphere had transformed completely. Master Kane recovered quickly, his momentary uncertainty masked behind a renewed smirk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, spreading his arms wide. "It seems our special guest has decided to join us after all." He gestured toward Chuck with exaggerated courtesy. "The man himself, straight from the movie set. Tell me, Mr. Norris, do they let you do your own stunts these days? Or is that too much of an insurance risk?" A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the crowd, but most remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of fascination and unease. Chuck still didn't speak. He simply began walking toward the mat. Unhurried, deliberate steps that seemed to measure out the distance with precision. His expression remained neutral, neither angry nor intimidated, simply focused. Lena couldn't tear her eyes away. "Is he really going to fight, Master Kane?" she whispered to Master Wu. The old man's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Watch carefully, young one. This is a lesson few ever witness firsthand." Kane had expected, had wanted a reaction. Anger, indignation, perhaps even fear. Chuck's calm demeanor clearly unsettled him, though he struggled not to show it. He bounced lightly on the balls of his feet, an unnecessary display of energy that contrasted sharply with Chuck's measured approach. For those unfamiliar with Mr. Norris's background, Kane called out to the audience, his voice carrying a mocking edge. "He's appeared in such classics as The Octagon and missing in action. Very impressive choreography, though I always wondered how those techniques would fare outside a Hollywood studio. Chuck continued his approach, now just a few steps from the edge of the mat. The crowd had gone completely silent again, all eyes fixed on his steady advance. "Mrs." Chen hurried forward, clipboard in hand. "Gentlemen, this isn't on the program. The exhibition is meant to be a demonstration, not a competition?" Kane finished for her, grinning widely. "But isn't that what martial arts is ultimately about? Testing skills against a worthy opponent?" He emphasized the word worthy, with just enough inflection to make it sound like a question. "This isn't appropriate, Mrs." Chen insisted, but her words were lost as Kane continued, speaking directly to Chuck now. "Tell me, Mr. Norris, which of your movie fights was the most realistic? The one where you defeated 20 men single-handedly? Or the one where you kicked a helicopter out of the sky?" Kane's voice dripped with sarcasm. A muscle tightened in Chuck's jaw, the first visible reaction he had shown, but still, he didn't speak. He simply stepped onto the mat, his movements fluid and controlled, stopping at a respectful distance from Kane. The crowd shifted, some standing for a better view, others exchanging uncertain glances. Parents with younger children began moving toward the exits, unsure of what might unfold. "Chuck has genuine credentials," Master Wu said quietly to Lena, his voice pitched just for her ears. "World karate champion. Multiple black belts earned through decades of dedicated training. His films may be entertainment, but his skill is authentic." "And Master Kane?" Lena asked, already suspecting the answer. Wu's expression remained neutral. "Kane competed in a few local tournaments many years ago. Limited success. His dojo emphasizes flash over substance, marketing over mastery." Something cold settled in Lena's stomach. For 2 years, she had dedicated herself to Kane's teachings, believing she was learning from a true master. Now, watching him mock a legitimate martial artist for the crowd's entertainment, doubt crept in like a shadow. On the mat, Kane circled Chuck, exaggerating his movements, playing to the audience. "The great Chuck Norris. What an honor." Kane performed an exaggerated bow, never taking his eyes off Chuck. "Shall we give the people what they came to see? Some of those famous roundhouse kicks, perhaps? Or do those only work when the bad guys are paid to fall down?" Still, Chuck remained silent. His stance was relaxed but ready. Hands open at his sides, weight balanced perfectly. Nothing flashy, nothing exaggerated, just the quiet readiness of a man who had spent decades honing his craft. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark. Kane, in his embellished gi, with dragons snaking down the sleeves, constantly in motion, talking, gesturing. Chuck in his simple street clothes, still and composed, letting his presence speak for itself. From somewhere in the bleachers, a voice called out, "Let him fight!" The cry was taken up by others, building quickly into a chant. "Let him fight! Let him fight!" Kane raised his hands, basking in the audience's energy. "Well, Mr. Norris? Shall we give them what they want? A friendly exchange between professionals?" His emphasis on the last word carried a clear challenge. For the first time since entering the gymnasium, Chuck Norris spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried easily across the now silent space. "I didn't come here to fight," he said simply. "I came to honor the martial arts community and support the next generation of students." Kane's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, wider and more forced than before. "How noble," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But isn't that what we're all here for? To showcase our arts?" He gestured broadly toward the audience. These people came to see real martial artists in action, not just forms and breaking demonstrations. Chuck's gaze remained steady, his voice calm and measured. Real martial artists understand when to fight and when not to. They don't use their skills to humiliate others or feed their ego. A murmur ran through the crowd. Kane's face darkened momentarily before he forced another smile. "Big words from a man who makes his living pretending to fight on camera," he said. His voice harder now. The pretense of joviality wearing thin. "Perhaps you're afraid your reputation won't survive contact with reality?" The air in the gymnasium seemed to grow thicker, charged with tension. Lena realized she was holding her breath. Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Looking around, she saw similar expressions of anticipation on every face, the collective sense that they were witnessing something significant, a confrontation that transcended the physical. Chuck didn't rise to the bait. His expression remained neutral, his stance relaxed but ready. "I have nothing to prove," he said quietly. Kane's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Nothing to prove? Or nothing to show?" He turned to the audience, arms spread wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems our celebrity guest is more comfortable fighting under the careful direction of a Hollywood filmmaker. Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The chant started again, louder this time, resonating through the gymnasium. Beside Lena, Master Wu sighed deeply. "Kane doesn't understand what he's inviting," he murmured. "What do you mean?" Lena asked, her voice barely audible over the chanting. "There are wolves who howl to declare their territory," Wu said, his eyes never leaving the two men on the mat. "And there are wolves who have no need to howl at all." On the mat, Kane continued his taunts, emboldened by what he perceived as hesitation. "Perhaps we should start with something simple. A basic exchange of techniques? Unless that's too much for a movie star?" Chuck remained still, his gaze steady. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" And then, with the same deliberate calm that had characterized his every movement, Chuck Norris stepped forward into a fighting stance. Nothing flashy, nothing theatrical, just the perfect balance and form that comes from thousands of hours of practice. The gymnasium erupted in cheers. Kane's smile froze on his face as he realized that the moment he had pushed for had finally arrived. Though perhaps not in the way he had anticipated. The Dragon Master was about to face a very different kind of opponent. The cheers swept through the gymnasium like a wave, cresting, and then falling into an expectant hush as Chuck Norris settled into his stance. It wasn't the exaggerated pose of a film actor playing a martial artist, it was the balanced, grounded position of someone who had dedicated his life to the discipline. Master Kane's smile tightened at the edges. He had expected, perhaps even hoped for refusal. A polite decline would have allowed him to claim victory without risk. Instead, he now faced the reality of his challenge being accepted, and by the murmurs rippling through the crowd, it was clear whose side they were on. "Well then," Kane said, his voice slightly higher than before. "Let's see what Hollywood has taught you." He settled into his own stance, flashier, wider, designed more for appearance than function. Lena leaned forward, barely breathing. She had watched her master dominate opponents all afternoon, had seen his aggressive style overwhelm traditional practitioners. But something told her this would be different. The calm in Chuck Norris's eyes wasn't the uncertainty she had seen in the earlier challengers. It was the tranquility of complete readiness. "Traditional rules?" Kane asked loudly, making sure the audience could hear. "Or would you prefer movie rules, where you miraculously recover from what should be knockout blows?" A few scattered laughs followed, but they quickly died away. The mood had shifted. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something more primal, more significant. Chuck didn't rise to the bait. He simply nodded once, indicating his readiness. Kane circled slowly, bouncing on the balls of his feet, hands weaving in small, unnecessary patterns, movements designed to distract, to impress. Chuck turned in place, his movements minimal, efficient, never taking his eyes off his opponent. "Begin whenever you're ready," Kane called out, his voice carrying a forced confidence. "I'll try not to hurt the star attraction." Without warning, he lunged forward with a lightning-fast combination. A jab followed by a roundhouse kick aimed at Chuck's midsection. The attack was quick, powerful, and executed with technical precision. It never landed. Chuck slipped the punch with a subtle shift of his upper body and deflected the kick with a forearm, his movements so efficient they almost appeared casual. He made no counterattack, simply returned to his ready stance. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Kane's eyes narrowed slightly, the first hint of real concern crossing his features. He attacked again, faster this time, a flurry of strikes designed to overwhelm through sheer volume. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut, spinning back kick techniques that had worked against his earlier opponents, delivered with speed and power. Chuck's defense was like watching water flow around stones. He slipped, blocked, and parried each strike with minimal movement, never losing his balance, never appearing rushed or concerned. Still, he made no offensive moves of his own, seemingly content to demonstrate the futility of Kane's attacks. Kane broke away, circling again. His breathing slightly elevated now. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent, every eye fixed on the mat. Even those who had been heading for the exits had stopped to watch. "Not bad for movie fighting," Kane said. But the taunt lacked its earlier conviction. He glanced quickly toward his students at the edge of the mat, as if seeking reassurance. Lena couldn't meet his eyes, her own gaze fixed on Chuck's perfect defensive technique. "Your move," Chuck said simply, his voice calm and even. Something flickered in Kane's eyes, a moment of uncertainty quickly buried beneath bravado. He lunged again, changing tactics, attempting to grapple and use his slight height advantage. He managed to grasp Chuck's gi, seemingly gaining the upper hand for a split second. Then, with a subtle shift of weight and an almost invisible hip movement, Chuck reversed the position. Kane found himself off balance, stumbling back a step before catching himself. He hadn't been thrown or struck, just perfectly countered in a way that made his own force work against him. The crowd gasped. This wasn't the flashy counter they had expected from an action star. It was something more impressive, effortless control that spoke of decades of practice. "Lucky move," Kane muttered, loud enough for only Chuck to hear. But his confident facade was cracking. Chuck remained silent, his stance unchanged, waiting. Kane attacked again, abandoning technique for aggression now, trying to overwhelm with raw force what he couldn't accomplish with skill. A flurry of punches and kicks came in rapid succession, some wild, others more controlled. All delivered with increasing desperation. Chuck's defense remained impenetrable. He blocked, deflected, and evaded with an economy of movement that made Kane's attacks look increasingly frantic by comparison. The contrast between Kane's aggressive energy and Chuck's calm efficiency was becoming more pronounced with each exchange. Breaking away again, Kane circled, his breathing heavier now. Sweat beginning to show through his elaborate guy. "Is defense all they taught you in Hollywood?" he called out, trying to recapture his earlier mocking tone. "Or are you afraid to show us what a real roundhouse kick looks like?" The taunt was meant to provoke, to force Chuck into an attack that Kane might counter. But Chuck simply adjusted his stance slightly and nodded once, an invitation for Kane to continue if he wished. From the sidelines, Master Wu leaned closer to Lena. "Do you see?" he asked quietly. See what? Lena whispered back, unable to tear her eyes from the mat. The difference between knowing techniques and understanding martial arts, Wu replied. Your master has learned many moves, but he fights from his ego. Mr. Norris fights from his center. On the mat, Kane was growing visibly frustrated. His attacks had failed to land, his taunts had failed to provoke, and with each passing moment, his carefully constructed image was eroding before a gymnasium full of spectators, students, and fellow martial artists. Enough warming up, Kane announced loudly. Let's see how you handle real pressure. He settled into a more focused stance. The theatrical elements of his style temporarily set aside. The attack that followed was Kane's best, yet a genuine combination of skill and power, executed with technical precision, a feint to the left, followed by a quick right cross, transitioning smoothly into a sweep aimed at Chuck's front leg. For the first time, Chuck moved offensively, not with the devastating roundhouse kick his films had made famous, but with a simple, perfectly timed counter. As Kane's sweep came in, Chuck shifted his weight, caught Kane's extended arm in a subtle joint lock, and used the Dragon Master's own momentum to send him stumbling across the mat. The move wasn't dramatic. It wasn't designed to hurt or humiliate. It was simply perfect technique, applied with exactly the right amount of force, at exactly the right moment. Kane managed to keep his footing, but only barely. He turned back, his face flushed with a mixture of exertion and embarrassment. The crowd had begun to murmur again, this time with growing appreciation for the skill they were witnessing. Chuck! 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 The chant started again, louder than before. Kane's expression darkened. He had initiated this confrontation, expecting an easy victory. Either Chuck would decline and appear cowardly, or he would accept and be outmatched by a real martial artist. Instead, he found himself being systematically outclassed in front of the very audience he had sought to impress. Lucky counter, he said, his voice tight. Let's see you do that again. Chuck didn't respond verbally. He simply resumed his ready stance, centered and calm. Kane attacked again, abandoning all pretense of technique now, driving forward with a barrage of strikes fueled by wounded pride and growing desperation. It was the kind of attack that had overwhelmed his previous challengers through sheer aggression. Chuck's response elevated the exchange from a martial arts demonstration to a masterclass. Each of Kane's attacks was met with precisely the right defense. Each wild strike countered with minimal force but perfect timing. Chuck never attacked outright. He simply allowed Kane's own energy to work against him, a physical manifestation of the philosophy that true strength lies in control, not dominance. The gymnasium had fallen completely silent except for the sounds from the mat, the shuffle of feet, the sharp intake of breath, the occasional slap of hand against gi. Even those who knew little about martial arts could recognize the vast gulf in skill they were witnessing. Kane broke away once more, breathing heavily now, his earlier smirk replaced by a grimace of frustration. He had thrown everything in his arsenal at Chuck Norris and had yet to land a single clean hit. Worse, he had been countered in ways that made his attacks look amateurish by comparison. "Is this how you fight in the movies?" he asked, his voice strained with the effort to sound dismissive. "Dancing around, without actually engaging?" Chuck's expression remained calm, but something shifted in his eyes, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the silent gymnasium. "You wanted a demonstration," he said quietly. "So, I'm demonstrating the most important aspect of martial arts: control." Kane's face flushed darker. "Control?" He spat. "Martial arts is about effectiveness, about dominating your opponent." "No," Chuck replied, his voice still measured and calm. It's about mastering yourself. Something snapped in Kane's eyes. With a guttural sound of frustration, he charged forward, all technique abandoned in favor of raw aggression. What happened next occurred so quickly that many in the audience would later disagree about the exact sequence. Kane launched a wild haymaker aimed at Chuck's head. Chuck slipped the punch effortlessly, and for the first time, launched a direct counter, a simple front kick, delivered with perfect timing and precisely calibrated force. The kick caught Kane in the solar plexus, stopping his charge instantly. He stumbled backward. The wind knocked from his lungs and dropped to one knee. It wasn't a devastating blow designed to injure. It was exactly enough force to make the point without causing harm, the physical embodiment of the control Chuck had just spoken about. The gymnasium erupted in cheers and applause. The difference in skill had been made abundantly clear. Kane knelt on the mat, struggling to regain his breath, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. Chuck stepped back, his stance relaxed but still centered. He hadn't raised his arms in victory or played to the crowd. He simply stood there, the same calm presence he had been from the beginning. In that moment, Lena saw something she would never forget. The true meaning of martial arts, exemplified not in flashy techniques or aggressive dominance, but in perfect control, both physical and emotional. The Dragon Master had been tamed by silence. The gymnasium vibrated with energy. Camera flashes popped like lightning as Kane struggled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation barely contained. The crowd's cheers for Chuck Norris had transformed into a sustained roar, with some spectators standing on the bleachers for a better view of the unfolding drama. Parents who had been heading for the exits now turned back, sensing that what was happening on the mat had transcended mere exhibition to become something more significant, a moment their children should witness. Kane straightened his gi with jerky movements, trying to reclaim some dignity. The elaborate dragon embroidery along his sleeve was now damp with sweat, the fabric sticking uncomfortably to his skin. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, attempting to smooth it back into place. "Lucky shot," he muttered. But even he didn't seem to believe it anymore. His carefully cultivated image was crumbling before hundreds of witnesses. Students who had gazed at him with awe now watched with uncertainty in their eyes. Parents who had paid premium fees for his instruction exchanged knowing glances, and fellow martial artists observed with expressions ranging from sympathy to poorly concealed satisfaction. Chuck maintained his distance, still centered, still calm. He hadn't celebrated his successful counter or played to the crowd. There was no triumphant fist in the air, no theatrical bow, no acknowledgement of the chants of his name that continued to ripple through the bleachers. His eyes remained fixed on Kane, alert but not aggressive, revealing nothing of his thoughts as he waited for the next move. "Do you yield?" Chuck asked quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for Kane and those nearest the mat to hear. The question wasn't asked with arrogance or as a challenge, it was offered as a dignified way out. A path to conclude what had become an increasingly one-sided encounter. Kane's face contorted, muscles tightening along his jaw. The simple question seemed to cut deeper than any physical strike. "Yield?" he repeated, almost spitting the word. "This isn't some tournament with points and referees. This is about showing these people real fighting." His voice had taken on a desperate edge, rising slightly in pitch. "One lucky kick doesn't end this demonstration. Demonstration, not fight." Even now, Kane clung to the pretense that this was just an exhibition, not a confrontation he had instigated, and was now losing badly. The semantic shift wasn't lost on those closest to the mat. Several of the other masters exchanged glances, recognizing the transparent attempt to reframe what everyone had witnessed. At the edge of the mat, Mrs. Chen stepped forward again. clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. Her normally composed demeanor showed signs of strain. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she surveyed the situation before her. The exhibition she had spent months organizing had veered dramatically off course. "Gentlemen, I think we've seen enough," she said firmly. "Perhaps we should—" "No!" Kane cut her off sharply, the word echoing through the gymnasium. Several spectators flinched at the rawness in his voice. "We're not finished." He turned back to Chuck, settling into his fighting stance once more. Though Lena could see the slight tremor in his hands, the uneven rise and fall of his chest as he struggled to control his breathing. "Let's continue." "Unless Hollywood needs a break?" The taunt fell flat, lacking the confidence and showmanship of his earlier provocations. It sounded hollow, desperate, the verbal equivalent of a fighter swinging wildly after being staggered by a blow. Chuck simply nodded once, resuming his own stance, relaxed, yet perfectly balanced. Nothing wasted, nothing exaggerated. His breathing remained steady, his movements fluid and controlled as he adjusted his position slightly on the mat. From the sidelines, Master Wu sighed deeply, the sound almost lost in the continuing murmur of the crowd. "Pride," he murmured to Lena, who hadn't realized she was holding her breath until that moment, "is often the last thing to surrender, even when defeat is certain. Like a wounded animal fighting harder," she whispered back, surprising herself with the insight. Wu nodded, his weathered face grave, and often more dangerously. This is the moment of greatest risk, when technique abandons a fighter and only raw emotion remains. Kane circled more cautiously now, the lesson of his previous charge not entirely lost on him. His earlier theatrical bouncing had been replaced by a more focused movement, his flashy hand gestures abandoned in favor of a tighter guard. For the first time that day, he approached a confrontation as a martial artist rather than a showman. "He's finally taking it seriously," Lena observed quietly. Master Wu nodded, his eyes never leaving the two men on the mat. "Fear has a way of stripping away pretense. We are most authentic when our masks no longer serve us." The crowd had fallen into an expectant hush, the earlier chants replaced by tension so thick it seemed to press against the skin. Camera flashes still punctuated the silence, capturing each moment of the unfolding drama. In the bleachers, a child asked a question too loudly and was quickly shushed by a dozen voices. Kane feinted left, then attacked with a combination of strikes more controlled than his previous wild assault, but still aggressive, still driven by something deeper than technique. A jab aimed at Chuck's midsection, followed by a roundhouse kick targeting the ribs, transitioning smoothly into an elbow strike as he closed distance. It was his best sequence yet, executed with genuine skill rather than theatrical flair. Chuck's defense remained impenetrable. He blocked the jab with a subtle forearm movement, swayed just enough to let the roundhouse pass harmlessly by, and redirected the elbow with a gentle but precise parry. He didn't counter, didn't take advantage of the openings Kane's aggression created. He simply defended, letting Kane exhaust himself against what seemed like an immovable object. Breaking off, Kane circled again, his breathing labored, sweat now streaming down his face and dripping onto the mat. His gi, once crisp and impressive, clung to his body in damp patches. The dragon embroidery that had seemed so intimidating at the beginning of the day now appeared gaudy and out of place against his increasingly desperate movements. "Is defense all you know?" he taunted. Though the words lacked their earlier bite, they sounded mechanical now, as if he were reading from a script that no longer fit the scene. "Or are you afraid to show these people what a real Hollywood punch looks like?" Chuck didn't respond verbally. Instead, for the first time, he initiated an attack, Not the devastating offensive his films might have suggested, but a simple, perfectly executed jab that slipped through Kane's guard and stopped just short of his face, demonstrating that he could have landed the blow had he chosen to. Kane flinched, jerking backward, even though the punch hadn't actually connected. His eyes widened momentarily, genuine fear flashing across his features before being quickly suppressed. The crowd gasped, then erupted in another round of cheers and applause. The message was clear. Chuck had been holding back, allowing Kane to attack and tire himself out. Now he was demonstrating that he could take the offensive whenever he chose. Something changed in Kane's eyes, a flash of genuine fear, quickly buried beneath renewed anger. His breathing became more ragged, his movements less coordinated. The disciplined martial artist glimpsed briefly and his last attack disappeared, replaced by a man driven purely by wounded pride and desperation. "Fight me for real," Kane demanded, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words bounced off the gymnasium walls, echoing slightly before being swallowed by the crowd's murmur. "Stop playing around!" Chuck remained silent, his expression unchanged. But there was a subtle shift in his stance, an almost imperceptible adjustment that Lena, watching intently, recognized as preparation rather than reaction. Kane's next attack came from that place of fear-turned rage. All strategy abandoned in favor of trying to overwhelm Chuck with sheer aggression. He charged forward with a battle cry, launching a flurry of punches aimed at Chuck's head and upper body, each thrown with full force and minimal technique. It was the kind of assault that had intimidated his previous challengers, that had made him appear dominant and unstoppable to impressionable students like Lena. It was exactly what Chuck had been waiting for. As Kane charged forward, Chuck sidestepped smoothly. His movement so precisely timed, it almost appeared casual. He caught Kane's extended arm just above the wrist, and with a simple circular movement, redirected the Dragon Master's momentum. There was no strain, no struggle, just perfect application of leverage and timing. Kane found himself thrown off balance, staggering forward with nothing to hit. His momentum carried him past Chuck, his arms windmilling slightly as he struggled to regain his equilibrium. Before he could recover, Chuck had circled behind him, applying the lightest of touches to Kane's shoulder, a reminder that had this been a real fight, a finishing strike could have landed there. The crowd erupted again, this time with understanding as well as appreciation. This wasn't just a physical confrontation. It was a masterclass in the principles that underpin all martial arts: balance, control, and the ability to use an opponent's force against them. Kane spun around, face contorted with frustration, a vein visibly pulsing at his temple. The last vestiges of his performative confidence had evaporated, leaving only raw emotion. "Stop playing and fight," he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. Chuck's expression remained calm, but his eyes had hardened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a new firmness. "This isn't a game to be won or lost," he said, each word measured and clear. "It's a demonstration of what martial arts truly means: discipline, control, and respect." "Respect?" Kane spat the word as if it tasted bitter. Spots of color burned high on his cheekbones, stark against the pallor that had overtaken the rest of his face. "You want respect? Earn it." He launched himself forward again, throwing a wild haymaker aimed at Chuck's head, putting all his remaining strength behind the blow. What followed would be discussed in dojos across 3 states for years to come. Chuck didn't just evade the punch, he controlled it, caught it, and with a subtle shift of weight and position, used Kane's own momentum to send him tumbling across the mat. The throw wasn't performed with excessive force or malicious intent. It was executed with exactly the right amount of energy to make the point without causing injury. Kane hit the mat hard enough to make a sound that echoed through the now silent gymnasium, a solid thump, followed by the lighter impact of his limbs. He skidded slightly before coming to rest near the edge, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the fluorescent lights overhead. His headband had come loose, his hair splayed in damp strands against the mat. The silence that followed was absolute. No cameras flashed. No one spoke. It seemed as if the entire gymnasium was collectively holding its breath, witnessing the conclusion of something that transcended mere physical contest. Chuck stepped back. His stance relaxed, but still centered. He hadn't followed up on the throw or pressed his advantage. He hadn't placed a foot on Kane's chest in triumph, or struck a victory pose for the cameras. He simply waited, allowing Kane the space and time to process what had happened. Slowly, painfully, Kane pushed himself up to a sitting position. His elaborate gi was completely disheveled now. The top pulled partially open, the belt askew. The dragon embroidered on his sleeve seemed to droop in defeat. He looked up at Chuck. And for the first time that day, the arrogance had been completely stripped from his expression. What remained was raw and unfiltered, a mixture of humiliation, anger, and beneath it all, a grudging recognition. "Is that all you've got?" he asked. But the words were empty, mechanical, the last gasp of a pride that refused to surrender even when thoroughly defeated. His voice was quieter now, lacking the projection that had carried his earlier taunts to the farthest bleachers. Chuck said nothing. He simply extended his hand, not in challenge, but in an offer of assistance. The gesture contained no triumph, no condescension, just the simple recognition of one martial artist to another. Kane stared at the outstretched hand for a long moment. The gymnasium held its collective breath. In that silent pause, something fundamental hung in the balance, not just the outcome of a physical confrontation, but a choice between continuing down the path of ego or accepting a moment of humility. Lena found herself leaning forward, unconsciously holding her breath. Beside her, Master Wu remained perfectly still, his weathered hands resting lightly on his knees. Across the gymnasium, she could see Kane's senior students watching intently, their expressions a mixture of concern and embarrassment. With visible reluctance, Kane reached up and took Chuck's hand, allowing himself to be helped to his feet. The simple gesture spoke volumes. It wasn't complete surrender, but it was acknowledgement, the first crack in a facade that had been maintained for years. The crowd erupted in applause, not the bloodthirsty cheering of spectators watching a fight, but the appreciative recognition of witnessing something authentic and meaningful. Masters nodded in approval. Parents applauded while explaining the significance to their children. Photographers captured the moment of connection between the two men. Chuck released Kane's hand and stepped back, offering a small, respectful bow, martial artist to martial artist, regardless of what had transpired before. After a moment's hesitation, Kane returned the bow, his movements stiff, with residual pride, but genuine nonetheless. In that exchange, without a word being spoken, the true lesson of the day was delivered more powerfully than any speech or demonstration could have conveyed. It wasn't about who was the better fighter or whose techniques were superior. It was about the spirit behind the techniques, the character revealed through conflict, and the recognition that true strength lies not in domination, but in control of one's body, one's emotions, and ultimately, one's ego. Without words, Chuck turned and walked calmly off the mat, leaving Kane standing alone in the center, the focus of hundreds of eyes. The Dragon Master stood motionless for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with as much dignity as he could muster, he too left the mat, disappearing quickly through a side door. As Chuck made his way back to his seat, the crowd's applause continued. People reached out to touch his shoulder or shake his hand. Some held out programs or scraps of paper for autographs, which he politely declined with a smile and a small shake of his head. Mrs. Chen approached with profuse apologies for how the exhibition had derailed, but Chuck simply smiled and assured her that sometimes the most valuable demonstrations weren't the ones on the program. Lena watched it all, transfixed. The exhibition would continue with other schools and demonstrations, but she knew that nothing would match what she had just witnessed. It wasn't the physical techniques that had left the deepest impression, but the contrast in character, Kane's desperate need to prove himself against Chuck's quiet confidence that required no external validation. "He didn't humiliate Master Kane," she said quietly to Master Wu. "He could have, but he didn't." The old man nodded. His weathered face creased in a gentle smile. "That is the mark of a true master, young one. Not the ability to defeat an opponent, but the wisdom to know when victory itself is not the goal." In that moment, Lena understood something profound about the martial arts journey she had begun 2 years earlier. It wasn't about collecting belts or winning tournaments or even mastering techniques. It was about developing something far more difficult to achieve: the strength of character that Chuck Norris had just demonstrated without saying a word. The match was over, but its impact was just beginning. The remainder of the exhibition proceeded according to schedule, but an undercurrent of electricity lingered in the gymnasium. Every demonstration was measured against what the audience had just witnessed, not in terms of technical flash or dramatic flair, but in authenticity and spirit. Masters led their students through kata with renewed attention to fundamentals. Breaking demonstrations emphasized precision over power. Sparring exchanges showcased control rather than dominance. It was as if Chuck Norris's wordless lesson had subtly transformed the entire event. Conversations buzzed in the bleachers, with spectators recounting details of the confrontation. Their voices hushed yet animated. Some mimicked Chuck's precise movements or Kane's increasingly desperate attacks. Parents explained to confused children the deeper meaning behind what they had seen: that martial arts wasn't about intimidation or showmanship, but discipline and respect. "Did you see how he never even raised his voice?" a middle-aged man whispered to his companion. "Not even when Kane was shouting and carrying on." "That's the difference between acting tough and being tough," his friend replied, nodding sagely. "One's for show, the other's for real." Chuck Norris remained for the duration, seated in the VIP section where he had been since his arrival. He applauded each performer respectfully, occasionally exchanging quiet words with those seated nearby. His presence had taken on an almost mythic quality. After the confrontation, people pointed him out to late arrivals, describing the encounter in increasingly embellished terms. Yet the man himself remained exactly as he had been before. Modest, attentive, focused on the demonstrations rather than his own celebrity. Though many approached to ask for autographs or photos, he gently deferred, explaining that this day was about celebrating all martial artists, not just those with Hollywood credentials. This, too, registered with the crowd: the genuine humility of a man who could have easily commanded the spotlight, but chose instead to redirect it toward others. Master Kane did not return to the gymnasium floor. His absence was conspicuous, leaving a vacuum that amplified the whispers and speculations. Some suggested he had left the building entirely. Others claimed he was nursing injuries in the locker room. A few of the more cynical spectators joked that he was rewriting his marketing materials to remove claims of being undefeated. His students, including Lena, remained at their designated area, exchanging uncertain glances. The Dragon Dojo was scheduled for one more demonstration before the closing ceremony. But their leader was nowhere to be seen. Their crisp white uniforms with the dragon emblem, which had seemed so impressive at the beginning of the day, now felt like costumes rather than martial arts attire. "What should we do?" whispered Trevor, one of the black belts, as the previous demonstration concluded, and Mrs. Chen looked expectantly toward their group. The clipboard in her hand showed the Dragon Dojo listed next, but the space beside it had been marked with a question mark in hurried pencil. Lena felt the weight of all eyes turning toward the Dragon Dojo's corner. For 2 years, she had followed Kane's instructions without question, had absorbed his philosophy that martial arts was primarily about dominance and appearance. She had practiced extra hours to perfect the flashy kicks he favored, had memorized the theatrical flourishes he insisted were essential to selling martial arts to an audience. Now, with that philosophy so thoroughly exposed, she found herself at a crossroads. A part of her wanted to quietly gather her belongings and slip out the side door, to pretend she had never been associated with the Dragon Dojo. Another part, the part that had initially drawn her to martial arts, recognized this as a moment that demanded courage rather than retreat. "We do what we train to do," she said finally, stepping forward. "But we do it with respect." The other students looked at her with a mixture of surprise and relief. After a moment's hesitation, they nodded, forming up behind her as they moved toward the central mat. The murmurs in the crowd intensified as people noticed the Dragon Dojo students approaching without their master. Instead of the flashy entrance Kane had choreographed, with its pounding music and theatrical poses, they simply walked in formation, bowed to the audience, and began their demonstration. Lena led them through the sequences they had practiced, but with subtle differences. The exaggerated battle cries were replaced with focused breathing. The unnecessary spins and flourishes were stripped away, leaving only the core techniques. The breaking demonstrations emphasized precision over showmanship. They performed the same techniques they had practiced: the synchronized kicks, the breaking demonstrations, the partner forms, but something was different. Without Kane's showmanship pushing them toward exaggeration, the movements became more genuine, more focused on execution than effect. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. From his seat in the VIP section, Chuck Norris watched with quiet approval. He wasn't the only one who noticed the transformation. Master Wu nodded slightly, his weathered face creased in a small smile. Other instructors leaned forward, noting the difference between this demonstration and the Dragon Dojo's earlier performance. When they finished, the applause was warm and appreciative, more genuine than the excited cheers that had greeted their flasher morning demonstration. As they bowed and prepared to leave the mat, Lena noticed Chuck Norris among those applauding, a small smile of approval on his face. The simple acknowledgement meant more to her than any trophy or certificate Kane had ever awarded. "Did you see that?" Trevor whispered as they returned to their area. "Chuck Norris was actually nodding at us." "Not at us," Lena corrected gently. "At what we did. There's a difference." As the students returned to their area, Master Wu approached Lena. His movement was unhurried but purposeful. His traditional gi, a stark contrast to the elaborate uniforms of the Dragon Dojo. "Well done," he said quietly, his voice pitched just for her ears. "You found the core beneath the flash." "It felt different," she admitted, surprised by her own candor with a master she barely knew. "Like we were actually showing martial arts instead of just putting on a show." Wu nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That is the beginning of understanding. The true path is not about how martial arts appears to others, but what it builds within you." He gestured subtly toward the other students, who were speaking in hushed, animated tones about their performance. "They felt it too, I think." Lena nodded, realizing he was right. There was an energy among her fellow students that hadn't been there before. Not the artificial excitement Kane cultivated with his pep talks and promises of tournament glory, but something more authentic. They had performed without their master's direction and discovered something valuable in the process. The closing ceremony began, with Mrs. Chen thanking all participants and presenting small tokens of appreciation to each school. When she called for the Dragon Dojo, Lena stepped forward to accept, bowing deeply in the traditional manner rather than with Kane's modified theatrical version. The moment wasn't lost on the audience, a subtle declaration of a shift in philosophy. As the crowd began to disperse, gathering belongings and filing toward the exits, Lena noticed a familiar figure standing alone in the corridor, leading to the locker rooms. Master Kane, his elaborate guy replaced by street clothes, watching the proceedings from a distance. His face was partially shadowed, but she could see enough to recognize the complexity of emotions there. Anger, embarrassment, but also something else. Something less certain. Their eyes met across the gymnasium. For a moment, Kane's expression hardened, and Lena feared he would turn away or berate her for changing their demonstration. Instead, after a visible internal struggle, he gave a small, tight nod before disappearing through the exit. "It's a start," said Master Wu, who had observed the exchange. "The journey from arrogance to humility is rarely completed in a single step. Do you think he'll change?" Lena asked, surprised by how much she still cared about the answer despite everything that had happened. Wu considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Change is always possible, but rarely easy, especially when it requires dismantling a self-image built over many years. He smiled slightly. But today he experienced something valuable. The difference between appearing strong and being strong. Such lessons tend to linger, even when we try to dismiss them. Lena nodded, understanding that what she had witnessed today wasn't just about martial arts techniques or a confrontation between two men. It was about two fundamentally different approaches to not just fighting, but living, one built on external validation and dominance, the other on internal discipline and respect. As the gymnasium emptied, the cavernous space gradually returning to its ordinary dimensions, Lena noticed Chuck Norris preparing to leave, speaking quietly with several of the other masters. He wasn't surrounded by an entourage or security detail, just engaged in conversation like any other participant in the day's events. Gathering her courage, she approached, waiting respectfully at a small distance until he noticed her. When he did, his expression was open and attentive, without a trace of the impatience celebrities often display toward admirers. "Mr. Norris," she began, bowing slightly, "I'm a student at the Dragon Dojo. I wanted to thank you for what you showed us today." Chuck smiled warmly, his eyes kind, but perceptive. "You led your group well in your teacher's absence," he said. "That takes courage." The simple observation caught her off guard. She had expected a polite acknowledgement at best, not this specific recognition of what the demonstration had cost her. "Thank you," she managed, then hesitated, weighing whether to continue. Something in his attentive silence encouraged her. "I've been training for 2 years, but I feel like I only started learning today. The way you handled everything, it wasn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I guess more fighting. More." She struggled to find the words to express the contrast between the action hero she had anticipated and the disciplined martial artist she had witnessed. "More like the movies?" Chuck suggested, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Lena nodded, embarrassed at how transparent her thoughts must have been. "Films are entertainment," he said gently. "They show techniques amplified for the camera, conflicts simplified for storytelling. But real martial arts isn't about who can hit hardest or look most impressive. It's about developing yourself, your discipline, your control, your character. That's not what Master Kane teaches," Lena admitted, then immediately regretted the disloyalty implied in her words. Chuck considered this, choosing his words carefully. Every teacher has something valuable to offer, even if it's sometimes a lesson in what not to do. He glanced toward the exit where Kane had disappeared. "Your master has skill, but he's fighting himself more than any opponent. Perhaps today will help him remember why he began this journey in the first place." Lena absorbed this, struck by the generosity of the assessment. Even after Kane's taunts and challenges, Chuck spoke of him with understanding rather than condemnation. There was no gloating, no dismissal, just a recognition of a fellow martial artist who had lost his way. "What should I do now?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Chuck's expression grew thoughtful. "That's for you to decide. True martial arts is about making choices about when to advance and when to retreat, when to strike and when to yield. Those choices extend beyond the mat into every aspect of life." He smiled again, including which path to follow and who to learn from. Before Lena could respond, Master Wu joined them, his approach silent despite his age. "Bothering our guest of honor?" he asked. But his tone was warm, suggesting the opposite of his words. "Not at all," Chuck replied. "We were discussing the choices a martial artist must make." Wu nodded sagely. "The most important techniques are not executed with the hands or feet, but with the mind and heart." He glanced at Lena with knowing eyes. "This young one shows promise. She has begun to see beyond the surface." Chuck turned back to Lena. "Listen to this man," he said, gesturing toward Wu. "He has much to teach anyone willing to learn." With that, he excused himself, pausing to thank Mrs. Chen once more before quietly exiting the gymnasium, declining the offers of escort or special treatment from the event security. There was nothing theatrical about his departure, no dramatic farewell, no grand gesture, just the same quiet dignity that had characterized his entire presence that day. Lena watched him go, struck by the contrast between his exit and Kane's earlier grand entrance. One sought attention at every turn. The other avoided it even when freely offered. One needed external validation to confirm his worth. The other carried his validation within himself. "He's exactly like they say, isn't he?" she asked Master Wu. "The real deal." "Chuck has never forgotten the core of what martial arts truly is," Wu replied. "That's why he remains a student even as a master, always learning, always growing." He gave Lena a meaningful look, a path that remains open to anyone willing to set aside their ego and embrace humility. The gymnasium was nearly empty now, the mats being folded and stacked by volunteers, the banners coming down. The exhibition was ending, but for Lena, something new was beginning, a reevaluation of everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about martial arts, and, perhaps, about life itself. She thought about the Dragon Dojo, with its flashy promotional materials and emphasis on tournament victories. She thought about Kane's frequent reminders that martial arts was primarily about dominating opponents. She thought about the countless hours spent perfecting techniques designed more for show than substance. Then she thought about Chuck Norris, not the action hero from movies, but the man she had witnessed today. His quiet confidence, his perfect control, his refusal to humiliate, even when provoked. Most of all, she thought about how his greatest strength had been revealed, not in attacking, but in choosing when not to attack. "Master Wu," she said finally, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Does your school accept new students?" The old man's eyes twinkled. "We have very strict requirements," he said seriously. "Students must be willing to work hard, to begin as beginners regardless of previous rank, and to understand that true progress is measured not by belts or trophies, but by growth of character. And if someone meets those requirements," Wu smiled fully now, "then they would be welcome at any time. Our door is always open to those who seek the true path." As they walked together toward the exit, Lena took one last look at the now empty mats where the confrontation had unfolded. In her mind, she could still see the two contrasting figures. Kane with his elaborate guy and theatrical movements. Chuck with his simple clothes and efficient technique. The image crystallized something within her, a clarity about which example she wanted to follow. Outside the gymnasium, The late afternoon sunlight bathed the parking lot in golden hues. Cars were pulling away. Families and spectators dispersing back to their everyday lives, carrying with them the memory of what they had witnessed. But for some, like Lena, the impact would go deeper than memory. It would become a turning point, a moment when the path diverged, and a choice was made, not just about where to train or which techniques to practice, but about what kind of person to become. In the distance, she saw Master Kane climbing into his sports car, a flashy red convertible with custom plates that read, Drago Known. His movements were stiff, his expression unreadable as he started the engine and pulled away, without acknowledging the few remaining students from his dojo who called out goodbyes. Beside her, Master Wu's ancient sedan sat modestly in the corner of the lot, as unassuming as its owner. "Would you like a ride?" he asked simply. Lena nodded, recognizing the symbolism of the moment, the first step on a new path. One that promised less glory, but greater growth. In a suburban gymnasium on an ordinary Saturday, a lesson had been delivered without words. A teaching conveyed through action rather than instruction. True strength isn't measured by how loudly you proclaim it, but by how quietly you embody it. True mastery isn't about dominating others, but about controlling yourself. And true respect isn't demanded through intimidation, but earned through humility. As Master Kane had discovered, sometimes the most powerful opponent isn't the one standing before you, but the one within. And as Chuck Norris had demonstrated, sometimes the most profound victory isn't defeating an adversary, but showing them a better way. The martial arts exhibition was over, but its most important lesson would endure long after the mats were stored, and the gymnasium returned to its everyday purpose, a lesson not found in any training manual or curriculum, but written in the silence between words and the space between actions. A lesson about the quiet power of humility. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.